Won't you lend your lungs to me? Mine are collapsing. Plant my feet and bitterly breathe up the time that's passed. Breath I'll take and breath I'll give. Pray the day's not poised. Stand among the ones that live in lonely indecision.
Hey, good morning, James. It's March 20th.
Good morning, Lynn, and good morning to Tony Cox on the upper left coast out there. I'm glad to be here. I just got home from the bar with Big Ron at 2 in the morning and didn't get to sleep till 6:35, so fortunately, I'm wide awake for this.
Yeah, you look really chipper.
Cool.
It's March 20th, which is a special day. Your birthday.
Oh, thank you. Yes, the 55th nail in the coffin. We have right now an ice storm is going on in Baltimore as we speak.
We have a water storm.
First day of spring. There's the most wonderful aspects about global warming. It's at the first day of spring in the armpit of the East Coast. We have an ice storm. There's about 1.5 inches of solid caked sleet out there.
Oh,
right now.
Don't go outside. Stay indoors.
Will do.
Okay, it's episode 32, and the topic I came up with today for James is bullying. And I prepared a series of questions, but James didn't look at them.
I saw that
okay.
the topic was bullying. I saw the title of the email.
Yeah.
Okay, but then there was this picture that Big Ron sent me of this female disc jockey that grabbed him between the legs while he was working the door at a bar, and then I got distracted. He's like, "What do you think, James? Is this worth waking up with a bullet hole between my eyes?" He said, "I'm thinking of coming out of retirement for this."
No, that's not true. Ron would never say that. He loves his wife.
Yes, he does. Yes, he does. And he has respect for her marksmanship, too, especially bedside marksmanship. Yeah, so anyways, sorry, that was about 6:15 when I finally saw that email. Sorry I didn't open it up. So
no, it's no problem.
Since I can't do two things with this computer at one time, I think maybe you could open up for me and tell me what's in it.
Of course, I'll tell you what's in it. Well, I wanted to talk about bullying. You were just recently on the Fatherland podcast, and I have to admit I haven't listened to it. But, well, I emailed you last night about bullying, and I have a series of questions. It has to do with, I have questions with regard to whether bullying might serve a social purpose. Is there any positive aspect to it? But more so on the difference between a healthy masculine hierarchy and these other types of behaviors that we see in schoolyards and in workplaces and all sorts of things. So I guess we'll open with that. Does bullying have any social purpose?
According to Peanut, it does.
Who's Peanut?
Peanut is he's a guy that walked into Jim Frederick's martial arts school seeking boxing instruction. And Mr. Frederick fatherly put his hand on his shoulder and pointed me out in the back where the punching bags were. And then as Peanut walked towards me, Frederick gave me the wink that meant, I don't want this animal training in my school, so find someplace else for him. So I was kind of like in charge of leaching social toxins out of the miniature body politic that was the student body before they got embedded. So I sent Peanut down to the Loch Raven boxing team, where I knew fellas, and Peanut did pretty well down there. I think he ended up disappearing, falling off the radar, and who knew what happened to him. But I did take the bus to work with him we didn't work together, but he lived out in Essex. We were both training in Towson, not too far from where I live now. And I worked out in Middle River, which meant I got off at Essex and walked out there. And he was very adamant. It was a conversation he had with other melanin-rich individuals in the back of the bus. And Peanut was a light-skinned guy. Not a real light-skinned guy, but what you call a red bone. Somebody has a red bronze cast to their features. And the legend in Virginia and Maryland is that these people have Native American ancestry, and I have no idea. But so he's like the light coppery skin type of guy. As boys, those fellows and other light skinned guys and super dark skinned guys will all get picked on and bullied by the milk chocolate population. You know, there's a very strict color hierarchy when it comes to bullying, and it gets even worse with women, particularly when they become attractive. You know, when they become young ladies and become attractive, and then you might get really savage attacks that require facial reconstruction and stuff like that. So when you're talking about bullying in urban areas in Baltimore, it's pretty touchy because some kids end up getting killed in this process. But he was adamant that it made him the man he was. It made him a better man. It made him stronger. Some men didn't approve of the kind of man he was, but he wasn't a criminal. He was out there working. The last time I saw him, he wasn't training at the gym anymore, but he was dressed up with slacks, shirt, and a tie on, and he was going for another job interview, and he was serious about it. So there was something about it that he took as a positive process. I've been involved in bullying that was negative, extremely negative, and some instances that ended up being positive growth opportunities. So it's all over the board. It depends on who they're doing it, what the motivation is, how nasty it is. Do you have any support system?
Yeah, and I think it depends a lot on the target. I mean, there's people who are going to be able to make something positive out of it, but I think it says more about that person than it does about the bullies or the bullying itself.
Among boys, if you have the tools to just shut it down right away, then that could become a positive thing. It could also, for instance, with me, I was severely bullied through most of my childhood. And when I finally developed the tools to shut it down, then I became really a monster. Somebody would just call me a name, and I'd pick them up and over my head and slam them on their back on the sidewalk. And I was completely vicious. I tried to kill people with my hands when they even insulted me by the time I was 13, 14 years old. I'd really become a psychopath based on this process. And there was a short period, I think a few months, when I was bullying one of my friends, a guy that I ended up becoming good friends with. And I had shut it out of my mind, but he later reminded me that I had done that. And I did remember pushing him around. I was like, wow, I even kind of put that out of my mind. This guy's name was Dale. And for a short time when I was like 14, I actually bullied this guy. It was kind of embarrassing to even say. So, yes, like a lot of forms of aggression, having it done to you in certain ways at times by certain people could end up resulting in you doing the same thing. That happened there for a while. And for the most part, people thought I was a bully when I was a younger teenager was because I would immediately attack anybody that started to call me names or pick on me or bully me. And I immediately became a far worse aggressor than they were to me, but I knew where this went. I knew if I let this go long enough, it's a circle of older kids standing around kicking at me and pointing their fingers at me while I'm laying there on the ground, because I'd been there when I was 5, 6 years old. And by the time I was able to defend myself, I got to the point where, it's death before dishonor. I'd rather die than to be called a name again or have to say bad things about my mother while this big Polish kid's grinding my face into the fence in the back alley or anything like that. Hope that wasn't too much of a digression.
No, not at all. Do you think that it's inevitable among groups of children?
Yeah, and men will oftentimes mimic it in the workplace and in sports in what is usually a much more good-natured way. If there's aspects of it where you're putting a check, if it's not too severe, in the workplace, depending on what kind of work you have, you'll have teasing will go on. And sometimes there's a jerk, and it does end up in violence in the workplace. But for most of my experience, you can do some kind of ribbing of somebody else. If the guy always cocks his As the guy always cocks the labels of his cans one way, but other guys might start calling him the Cyclops or something like that, and eventually he'll ask why, and say, well, all your labels are like 45 degrees off, So he thought maybe that one eye was a glass eye. So you could do stuff like that, and as long as you back off of it at whatever point it seems to bother the guy.
I think that's something kids can't really do. That I don't know if it's true, but you hear about rattlesnakes, like baby rattlesnakes are more likely to be more toxic in their bites because they just let out all their venom at once. And I think of that when I think of children, because there is a little bit of back and forth is kind of normal and natural, but kids just don't know when to stop sometimes. So just keep going.
Well, sure. They have less sense of boundaries, and the cruelty of children's pretty much legendary, at least in our society. If you're a little kid, other children will tend to be cruelest to you. I found, though, that the cruelest thing was I didn't mind getting bullied by kids that had my physical capacity. There was a certain amount of pain to being ostracized. I generally have been ostracized by every group I've been associated with in one way or another. And it started from the time I was little. And you can use that as an individual for creative pursuits, for energy, for a way to isolate yourself for more contemplation or more training or more improvement and harder work. There's a lot of things you could do. There's a lot of things I've done that I wouldn't have done if I had a nice wide circle of friends in different points in my life, that I think are things that were ultimately beneficial to me or my cause. But what really bothered me was having people that weren't children. They were teenagers. They were youths. Having teenage guys beat me up and pick on me when I'm 6 to 10. Having man-sized creatures taking over my life, forcing me to do things, even if it's just saying bad things about my mother, or forcing me to say uncle, or I suck, or you're better than me, that really struck deep. That's still, in some ways, I talked to the Fatherland guys. The one fellow coach was perplexed that I would be so angry at this white guy that's trying to mug me when I'm not angry at all at the black guy that's helping him try to mug me. And I think a lot of it goes back to just, it wasn't a rational thought. It was just my feeling. I was in a rage because I just had this history of being picked on by men in that same basic age group, teenage white guys, when I was a little kid. And then when they come after me when I'm an old man, I just want to do horrible things. And I descend into this unreasoning rage. And it's hard for me to get out of it. And I did get out of it when I was dealing with the 3 construction workers who had just gotten their coffee and decided to pick a fight with me. That was a no-brainer. These guys would kill me. I'd end up eating a hammer, and it would have just been horrible. So I buried it, but it is one of the reasons why I couldn't control myself with that other white dude a few weeks later, and it was only a few weeks later, is I had to eat that. I had to suck that down. And it just tasted too bad. And I think a lot of what that is my childhood experiences welling back up inside of me. So I think that's an example where I disagree with the eminent Peanut in terms of bullying as a positive force. For a child, bullying by older kids and parents can be extremely negative.
I agree with that. It's hard for me to see any positive in it. I can see positive when the context is that is it very limited, right? I don't see beating as ever going to be a positive. A little bit of ribbing in terms of feedback, like you were talking about at work, that's something that makes sense. And I don't know if kids can do that, but if it's something like that, then I could see a social benefit. But when it's just really predatory behavior, bigger kids on a smaller kid, I don't see anything positive in that.
It's happened enough that it's really an iconic thing in children's literature. Even John Jake's set of novels, North and South, that's how it starts out with Charles, who becomes the main character and rides with, against the Sioux Indians after the Civil War. His life starts out with him being bullied, and he learns from his Uncle Worry the value of dueling and preserving your honor. This was in the Old South. I can see one positive benefit. If we look at the situation we're in now, where you have some people who psychologically don't have a problem dealing with the fact that we live under such a predatory psychology, the fact that you can lose your ability to make a living if you say the wrong thing. And you talk about bullying, the political correct atmosphere that is the United States and the modern world. That's probably the most extreme form of bullying. And some people, including myself, seem to be better at dealing with this without sticking their head in the sand and not letting it embitter them and bring up a lot of anger, I think, because I had a lot of experience dealing with being bullied by somebody that was an unstoppable force. My uncle, who was a college football player, my cousin, who's a high school wrestler, if they're picking on me, and I'm 9 years old, what can I do? I can't do anything. And my voice doesn't even matter because I'm some little kid who could barely peep over the edge of the table where all the adults are sitting having their far more important conversation than the conversation about turning me into a pretzel that's happening in the other room. So I think it did make me strong in that aspect, and I was able to endure a lot. And this was actually part of the Spartan system. And I'm not a Spartan file, okay? I'm not a Spartan lover. I think they're the greatest thing that ever happened, but you ended up with soldiers that had legendary toughness, and it was developed in a severe bullying environment that they had, which would be way beyond any type of hazing that military institutions have done recently. It also ill-suited them for being occupational troops. When they started to build an empire, these guys became the cruelest creeps in the ancient world and started doing terrible things. That kind of cruel subjugation to authority and the endurance that you develop, it can warp your psyche also. I think we saw the same thing with Imperial Japanese soldiers when they're the bravest soldiers out there based on how many times they ran at machine guns that were cutting them down. But once they became occupational troops, they engaged in excessive cruelty. It was beyond anything that any other military did in the modern era. And it could have something to do, again, with that being subjected to, for a long period of time, a social force that you cannot fight back against and that you have to either hide from or subjugate yourself to.
Well, you mentioned Sparta, and I earlier wanted to ask you too if you have other other comparisons you can make to this social phenomenon. I think it stems in part from just the way we organize our schools, that although you mentioned situations which were not related to school, family situations, but let's say probably the largest portion of bullying takes place in schools and has to do with putting all these kids together with not too much supervision. So what are there parallels to that in history? What can you say about that?
Well, if we look at the type of bullying that goes on in school, predominantly one grade of students ignores the other grade of students. And you have all these same grade bullying problems. And these usually have to do with either a great disparity, where you, for instance, have a man, somebody who's physically a man picking on somebody who's physically a child. That would be one thing. And I think that's more rare than the type of bullying that seems to have triggered things like school shootings, where you have a group of people, a clique, for instance, maybe the football players, maybe the soccer players. It depends on who's the set of athletes in the school that have the most social standing. If they start singling out people, individuals, and then as a group pick on them, then you're looking at something that mimics some historical institutions. And we talked about the Spartan agoge. One would be the British Navy, where you were routinely beaten. Now, to a large extent, the slave economy in the early United States, and we're talking about slaves of all races, how they were treated was based on how English sailors were treated. the first people to inflict discipline upon any plantation slave population were the sailors that brought them over. Overseers would be drawn from this type of people. The idea that fighting men, soldiers, would be regularly beaten, sailors, who had the toughest soldiering job at that time period. Being a sailor was the worst job. You're killed by giant splinters and by gigantic iron bowling balls bouncing around on a ship, ripping your legs off. These guys that were the best sailors, and not the best soldiers, but the bravest soldiers in the plantation period, were generally regarded to be the English fighting men, British, because a lot of these guys were Scottish, Welsh, Irish, and they were severely brutalized. They were regularly beaten by a cat of nine tails. So there's this 9 knots of rope on the end of this rope, and you've got a strong man swinging it up to 200 times on you, to the point where flesh is actually flying off of your back. There was a guy in Australia, an overseer, who used to sing this ditty, and one part of it was, "Another half pound off the beggar's ribs," was what he would use when he'd swing this cat of nine tails. And there was even a man that they were trying to figure out how they could beat him more over the years. He had been beaten so often that he had no flesh on his soldiers, and you could see his white bones through his skin. This was down in Australia. So this is institutionalized bullying that can make for some very obedient soldiers who will walk into cannon fire and get slaughtered and serve their masters that way, but tend not to do great improvisational things in combat. You know, this group of soldiers, these Brits, they were real good for dying. And there's a lot of famous British last stands. You know, there's really stubborn, brave, but not very adept British soldiers getting slaughtered. It happened in the Khyber Pass. It happened at Ndizwana in South Africa when the Zulus overran Chelmsford's column. You'd have these famous things that would happen to these people that would make them seem like the bravest of the brave. But in terms of taking a psychological risk to disobey a direct order and to do something to save your command instead, or thinking outside of the box, they did not do well. And that type of mentality didn't do well in what we now call fourth generational warfare, which is how the Aboriginal people would fight that they went against. So at the same time, you have a group of people who had a tradition of never striking their children for any reason. And that was Native American warrior societies, where every person in that type of small-scale wilderness warfare has to be a little officer in his mind, has to be able to think outside the box and behave like a hunter, not like some suicidal robot. And all types of men throughout history and prehistory that were involved in warrior cultures, as opposed to types of soldiering, which is being a warrior slave, they always valued even treatment and psychologically mentoring of the young male, as opposed to brutalizing him and subjecting him to this authority.
I think there's a logistical difference, too. In a hunter-gatherer society, you have smaller groups, and you don't get these large concentrations of people who are the same age, and
That's a very good point.
Yeah, that have to. They do have to. You've talked about hierarchies, but these even kids have to establish some. These kids are trying to manage themselves. They're not equipped for it, and I think that's part of what drives it. Is that you can't just put a bunch of immature people together with no leadership and expect a good outcome. These kids have to find a way to organize themselves socially, and that's one driver of it. So I think that's one thing that's really different about any kind of hunter-gatherer or even a small village, a small European village compared to suburban life where we have these really large schools. And
yes.
And it's one reason I like homeschooling. Although it's opposite, right? Everyone thinks that you have to do that for socialization.
That's a slave mentality. It's a slave mentality. What the public schools mimic now is the very large English American family around 1700 to 1850, where you're having 10 to 15 children, wearing one wife out and replacing her with another one in order to get a large enough workforce where you can sell some of these kids off, you can rent some of these kids. You can have some of them take over your duties as you age and become infirm. And you have this, you're trying to build an economic unit that's the size of a small business out of a family. And you end up with a bunch of children together who outnumber the parents, outnumber the adults that they're interacting with. You only get that in certain boom situations like that, or like where you're literally outbreeding the native opposition by 10 to 1 as a conscious expression of populating what's seen as an empty, godless land. So I'm of the opinion that since we don't need runaway population growth, and we should be at least replacing ourselves and maybe increasing the population of intelligent, non-savage people by at least a small margin, you're better off having the child outnumbered by the adults in their life.
Yeah, I agree with that. And I think even something just a little bit closer to parity. And I think large families are wonderful, so I don't want to discourage anyone from having a lot of children. But even in a family situation, a large family, there will be a gradient in the ages of the children that will contribute to that. So you're not going to get 10, you might have twins, but you're not going to get 10 children that are all the same age. So you can develop a healthier environment that way.
So the types of schools we're talking about are really abominations. They only, in the most basic way, reflect the type of parenting that was basically slave parenting in early America, where you're just generating little slaves. Now to the family, now you're generating slaves to the larger society, and it's more faceless and more monocropping. And I disagree with it. I do have one little story of a young girl that looks like maybe she's about the same age as the one sitting on your knee. I've written about her before. Emma, she's Megan's granddaughter. And Megan can only watch her most days of the week. She has to go to daycare sometime. And Emma's very precocious. She's spent a lot of time with multiple adults. And in the daycare setting, the other children will actually wait for her. The other children her age will all wait for her. And they've just unconsciously nominated her as the leader. And it's largely based on her willingness to defy adult authority. She spends more time in time out than the other kids put together in that group, but they can't wait for her to show up.
Troublemaker.
She's like she's their revolutionary leader in this little daycare setting. But she also has a problem with being a little bit too rough with some of the kids too, because she doesn't have the maturity yet. She's a 2-year-old ruler of a 7-person kingdom. So.
Well, what should parents do for their kids if your kid's getting picked on, or if you, just in case everybody's at risk for it, right?
You don't want to do what every child fears, is that the parent is going to show up and drop the magic camera on the other kids and basically, in the eyes of all the other children, take your agency away, make you seem a baby, totally dependent upon your parents for everything. You want to do things to arm them to deal with other children in a good fashion. I did once when my oldest son was being robbed at school. I handed him a razor blade, and I told him, I said, the next time you try to take your coat, you just grab a hold of the guy's hand. And I showed him how to slash the wrist diagonally. I said, this will be hard to sew up, and this guy's going to have no alternative other than to use his other hand that he would be beating you or taking your coat away from you with to stop the bleeding. And he just looked at me and he gave it back to me. He said, I'm not you. I can't do that. So he had to find another solution, and that was to seek the companionship of like the roughest, most criminal white boys in the school to protect him from the black guys that were stealing his coats and beating him up. So that was a failure on my part. I could have maybe come up with a better solution when I was older and wiser, but I was myself in my 20s, and this is how I was dealing with adult men in Baltimore City trying to rob me, was with the threat of lethal force. And that was maybe not totally appropriate for junior high school.
Well, maybe not as a first measure, right?
Right. So maybe I failed in parenting right there, and should have provided something more flexible than cutting open the arteries of your enemy.
Since I became a parent, I just learned that parents fail every day. So I hope you don't feel bad about that. You were doing your best, and I agree with you. I think that arming the kid, maybe not literally arming them, maybe teaching them a little bit of self-defense, some way to protect yourself physically is good, because I think part of it is autonomy for a kid, that you have to sort of think about yourself and protecting yourself, and that you're not as at the mercy of these people. You don't have to be. I don't know if that makes sense. Just thinking about my experiences.
If you think about the fact that I've written numerous books coaching men on how to achieve and maintain what I call fractional autonomy, which is being able to keep enough of your own personal sense of freedom, even if it's just freedom to walk on a sidewalk and not be robbed. And that's taken multiple volumes to even try to get those principles across, because they're difficult to apply in a society that's devoted to their opposite. Our society is devoted into making slaves of us all in terms of our mindset. And you're dealing with individuals. You're not just dealing with groups. I have general strategies for dealing with different groups, different types of people. But when it comes down to it, you've got to be willing to customize your counter-aggression techniques that you're using for the individual that's in front of you compared to the last one that you had to deal with, and even be able to adapt when they change, because this person that tries to bully you is going to end up changing. They're going to become worse, or they're going to become better. At some point, you have to be able to adjust your behavior. And as a teenager, I failed to do that. I failed. I didn't have the social sense to be able to perceive when I was now no longer being bullied, but I was feared, and I'm still behaving the same way, and it's having negative consequences. That's going to be very difficult to do. It's going to require what it requires to train a fighter, which means regular conversations. If you think about your child, and if you think of them in terms of a fighter, well, then this would be like somebody that's fighting 5 days a week, and how you would have to talk to him. That guy, somebody like a boxer from the 1940s, when they used to fight constantly, their coach was constantly busy. At that point, the fighters would train each other, and the coach is a psychologist to all these guys, and he's constantly busy talking to them about what's happening with this guy in the gym and this guy in the ring, and constantly updating and adjusting the advice. And as a parent, that's what you have to do, and it's difficult to do if you're a father that doesn't have custody and you get to see your child once a week.
Yeah, and it's difficult to do if you're working and your child's in school all day. It's hard to maintain that bond where it's easy to talk to each other. And as kids grow, I know it's hard. You just wrote about a father whose boy is playing video games, and the dad doesn't have much. It feels like he can't reach him. Doesn't have much to talk about with him.
Paul.
Yeah.
That was I hadn't seen Paul in about 5 or 6 years, and that was he was having a tough time dealing with that. Ismail suggested meeting the child, his son, halfway, and if the only thing he's interested in is video games, actually play some video games with him and try to use that as a stepping stone to getting him to do activities with the father that are not video games, and maybe even a compromised activity, maybe not the sports that the father did when he was a child, but something, maybe ping pong is halfway between playing soccer and playing a video game. Maybe that could be it.
Yeah.
It's a real problem when you're dealing with, it's supposed to be natural for children to not want to emulate their parents and to rebel against the parents as a regular thing when they hit adolescence. And I don't know how much I buy that. I think a lot of it has to do with the fact that children are going to model themselves over those people they spend the most time with.
That's what I was going to say.
Time with a peer group.
Yeah.
Well, then you're competing with that too. Forget the brainwashing teacher that's doing her own amount of damage, but what about these other children and their peer pressure?
And I think the only thing I can think of as a counter is just the quantity of time. When I was coming up, I remember it was quality time. Your parents were supposed to try to spend quality time with you, but I think that there's something to the quantity of just hanging out. It's hard when a kid is absorbed into a video game because you could spend hours and he doesn't even know you're there. But if you can get away from the video games and just spend time together without any particular goal, that helps.
I had a much more success with my younger son than my older son because, it's unfair to the oldest that you learn on them and you use the lessons on the next generation and they get more effective attention. After what happened with my oldest son, with just seeing the way school and work just totally pried us apart, I decided that I would just forgo sleep, even though I was working just as much when Glenn was coming of age, when he was a little boy. He wasn't really coming of age yet in terms of puberty, but he's going to school 5, 6, 7, all the way up to 10 years old. I would go get him from school. I would work. I'd head out to work at 9 o'clock at night, and I'd get home about 2 o'clock in the afternoon. That would be my normal work day. Some work days, I didn't get home till 7 o'clock at night, so I wouldn't have any contact with him other than seeing him for dinner time. And then rather than sleep, I would stay up and do things with him, and I would sleep on the bus on the way to work. What I preferred to do was to come home at 2 in the afternoon, go pick him up from school. While we were walking home from school, we would talk about his school day. That's all done. By the time we get home, the school is way in the rearview mirror. That's finished. And we would generally play Army Men. I collected Army Men for him. We would have whole floors of the house. I know it drove my wife crazy. Whole floors of the house would just be battlefields. There'd be tanks and their unit cards around, and we'd keep track of the morale of the units and stuff like that. Sometimes fight over the kitchen for supplies or whatever it is. And this actually impressed his friends, and actually impressed the friends of his older brother, because to the extent that I could, I did the same thing with his older brother. Actually got down on the floor and played with him. And this was something that no other fathers did. Dante will still say that to people. Mr. Jim played with me. Nobody plays with their kids. I'm going to play with my kid. So he does stuff with his daughter, whatever she's into, which is kind of funny to see. That is a combination of both. And I also didn't exclude his friends. If he had a friend he wanted to spend time with, the kids would usually be really up for playing with Glenn's crazy dad. And this eventually grew into other activities like playing Monopoly, Scrabble, Risk, even complicated simulation war games. The fact that you had an adult constructively doing things with these boys between 5 and 13, which is when I did all this play with him, before he started just getting involved in his own activities, that in a lot of ways modeled what we had done together. He got interested in playing card games and board games and actually made a living out of doing these things. He was financially independent by the time he was 16. And that, I just trace it back to us having that time doing stuff that was constructive and competitive. I did do a certain amount of role playing. I didn't try to win all these Army Man wars. I would make mistakes and hope that he would catch me. I wanted to make sure that he ended up winning, but that it wasn't easy, and that he had a sense that it was hanging in a balance all the time. And at a certain point, his superior ability shooting rubber bands started to turn the tide on Dad, and I would start suffering great losses that he could celebrate because he was better at shooting little Army Men from across the room with rubber bands. But this extended to sports activities with him as well. He ended up working with me at the boxing gym and boxing and stick fighting until he developed his own interests, but he developed his own interests, and he segued from that into doing stuff with his own peer group that he cobbled together, and they weren't all his own age. And now I'm occasionally invited to come over for Saturday game night, and play the games that they play and do the things that they do. And with me is essentially the child when it comes to learning these games. That's come full circle. Now, I don't have much of anything to show him, and he has things to show me.
Well, what if your child is the aggressor? What should a parent do?
Oh, they need to be talked to. And children have feelings. You understand what affects your children's feelings, and then you can use their feelings as talking points in discussing them. Because there's wanton cruelty amongst children without empathy. It's not normal. It doesn't happen that much. It takes a while for that to develop through years of this type of school system that they're subjected to. So you have to do what Megan does with her granddaughter when she talks to her about how she doesn't like to have her toys roughly taken from her. Then other children wouldn't like that either, and you want to treat people the way they treat you. It's really basic stuff. It's not difficult, and it's not hard to battle when you don't have a lot of other adult forces arrayed against you. If you don't really have other negative adult forces against you, you can even successfully coach your child through dealing with a peer group that they spend a lot of time with. As long as it's not higher quality, which is not going to be, and a higher quantity than what they spend with you. So on the weekend, you need to spend a lot of time with them. Take them along with what you're doing. A lot of parents can't wait to get away from their children, even though their children haven't spent much time with them and they've been in school. So just avoiding those basic mistakes and spending the time with them that you can, that's going to help you be successful and coaching them through dealing with their own peer group. And the more that you can keep them out of some kind of monocrop, same age peer group and have them dealing with you and older children and younger children and other adults, the more successful your coaching is going to be. They're just going to have such a huge advantage.
Yeah, there's no substitute for spending time with your kids and trying to know them and their friends. You know, have them come to your house. You know, that was always a strategy I admired in certain parents, that they'll have everybody come to their house, you know, when the kids want to get together.
That's a good idea. We did that with both of our sons. Both of our sons did as good or better than the other people in their circle of friends. With my oldest son predominantly and starting a family of his own, him and his friends all pretty much made out about the same. They're in the trades. They're making enough money that if their wife works, they can own a decent house that's not in some high crime area. But I think only him and one other of his childhood friends actually ended up with families. And these are guys that are 42 years old now. Him and Josh, Vance and Josh, both had families. Dante didn't end up really with a family. He's got a daughter. And then with my younger son, he's in a generation where it's apparently none of these people in their 20s want to have kids. He's far more successful than all the people that he grew up with. And I really assign it, one, to the time he spent with me doing constructive play and athletics, and two, to this time he spent with my mother when I was working weekends very heavily. And I basically wasn't around during the weekend. My mother, who had an antique business, would take Glenn to all her purchases she made. He learned how to wheel and deal from her. He got his first job because he learned how to wheel and deal from her. And he gained a lot from that, and it gives you the value of a grandparent right there. He spent 2 days, 3 weeks out of the month, he spent 2 days a week with his grandmother as her little assistant in the antique business, and they would do yard work together. She was cutting the lawn with him. He ended up cutting lawns for a living too before he was 14 years old, and then after that he did other things. There's no substitute for that adult.
Yeah, grandparents are really valuable, and that's one thing that's getting harder with the older families. Like your younger son doesn't have kids yet, but if he does in his 30s, then he'll be a little older, but the kids' grandparents will be a lot older. You know, that's kind of what's going on in my family, where my parents and the grandparents don't help as much as they did in the previous generation because they're older.
Right. That's true. Though, if my youngest son decides to have children, they'll be lucky to see me on a respirator. And that is one of the downfalls of this. Wait till you're 35 years old to have kids, which is the common wisdom now, that you're going to wait until the woman's biological clock is actually going into critical countdown.
Midnight.
Just think how crazy that is. It's like you make movies about taking that route to stopping a nuclear war. It's like 5 minutes to midnight. Okay, now the movie gets really good. Well, that's not really the place where you want to start your family if you have a choice.
Yeah.
You want to do it when you don't want to do it when you're 18 and you're idiots. But I don't, unless you're a woman that's married an older guy that's got more maturity to add to the relationship. It's really unnatural waiting until your 30s to start your families, which is what is promoted.
Oh, it's really standard. I had my kids at 32 and 35. I don't think I ever told my age before.
You're chronologically doxed.
And that's not even remarkable in my peer group. That's really considered pretty young and moderate age to have a family. And I really sometimes really wish I had done it 10 years earlier than that.
It's absolutely a mark of the materialistic focus of our society that your third priority is starting a family.
Yeah.
Behind your career and your house. You're not supposed to start a family until you've actually nailed down the house.
Yeah, that's common. And, in my peer group, it's a lot of international vacations and European cars or electric, Tesla or something like that now. Okay, well, we've talked about bullying, I think, primarily as physical violence and intimidation, but this is the 21st century, and a lot of bullying takes place online now. So what do you make of this? How do you, my solution is easy. You just turn everything off. We don't have that problem yet. My kids are younger, but I don't have a problem with just turning off things, TV or whatever it is.
Well, you might be surprised coming from me, or maybe not, that I see something more sinister behind this than just children using the latest technology. The answer is to go offline. I don't think children should spend significant amounts of time online.
Yeah.
I basically watched my grandson disappear before my eyes, getting sucked into this machine he was handed. That now it becomes hypnotizing. It occupies them, and that there's ways that they could be gotten to psychologically through whether it's advertising or whether it's bullying. And you think about it, what's not bullying if advertising is not bullying? And particularly the way advertising was done in the 1950s and 60s, where you actually have studies of how the advertising worked at the period. This was the kind of stuff that originally triggered the move for the 5 to 8 year house. You start looking for a new house in 5 years, and you're a loser if you're not in a new house in 8 years. And it totally uproots your children through their whole childhood, moving them from area to area. And this actually came from the type of bullying that is advertising, which, basically rich adults use on poor adults. Captain Cook was trying to get his crew to eat sauerkraut. And he got them to eat sauerkraut by making the officers eat it at the table. And he said whenever they see their betters partake of something, it's as good as gold. And so that's a very subtle form of it. Yes, it was a countermeasure for scurvy. Turned out that the vitamin C levels weren't high enough in the sauerkraut to prevent it, but other measures he took did prevent it. The answer is to keep your child offline and make that. I do that with myself. That's one reason why I had to get off Facebook when I was on there for a while. I'll only be online for a couple hours a day. Most of the time when I'm writing now, I'm not online, and it's increased my reading. I've found out that I'm reading a lot more books than I was when my computer was always online, when I was operating from the wired desktop instead of this laptop. So Oh, I wrote a story. One of my first stories I wrote, I forget the title of it, but it was about a guy named Dwayne Gridless, who was the last guy to resist mandatory chipping, where everybody's getting basically the smartphone chip is going into your wrist, and everybody's now online, and everything's done by a wrist scan and everything. And they finally bagged this guy. He gets caught killing squirrels. So some old lady that's feeding the squirrels tells on him. The reporters all get to him right before he's chipped, and they want to know where his pot of gold is hidden and everything, because now he's become this mythical creature because he's the last guy that's not online. And I see that happening if our level of technological advancement continues. I see that happening in 20 years. I see 2040 being a year where in a society like the United States, only hunted criminals would not be microchipped.
Well, I don't know that.
And they would be hunted.
Yeah, and the microchipping is almost superfluous already because most everybody has a smartphone that doesn't leave their person and that knows where you are and it listens to you all the time. So we probably will get microchips, but we're in a lot of senses we're already there.
If you can't do anything without the barcode that's imprinted on your wrist or whatever, then yes, you might as well be physically part of the machine. If there's no catch.
Yeah.
Going to a cashless society is going to be a very important aspect of implementing this.
Well, the thing is, my kids are little, right? But I have some experience in this. When I guess I was in high school or maybe early college, one of my siblings would play a lot of games on his computer, his PC. And I could tell that he wasn't doing school, like he wasn't doing any of his schoolwork. So I actually just went over there one day and unplugged the keyboard and took it away, and I locked it up in my car. Okay, I was 18 because I didn't get my car till I was 18. So I had these little cubbies in my car that could lock with a key, with the ignition key. I took away his keyboard and I locked it away, and he was so angry. He was like threatening my life. I don't know. I just laughed at him, but we have it now with videos where my kids watch videos, a little bit of videos here, during the day, but they want more videos, and then you say no, and they scream and yell. Okay, and this is awful for parents. You don't like to hear your kids scream and yell, right? But this is what you have to do. So I took the death threats from my brother, and I take the kids screaming and yelling today. And my brother today he recognizes that was a good thing that I did for him, but he was really upset, and he ended up getting another keyboard. Secretly he bought a keyboard, and he would keep it hidden, but it still worked because he had to keep it a secret, so that cut down the number of hours that he could spend on it. If you think it's important, you just have to bite the bullet and do it, and it's not easy. Your kids will hate you. Well, I don't know where we are. I think this is going to be a short one, but
any questions that we didn't address here on bullying that you had listed?
I don't think so. I think we covered what I wanted to cover. The thing that maybe you could talk about more, if you wish, is hierarchies and how men establish hierarchies, and how that's different from what you get with bullies. Because I'm still kind of caught on this idea that some people think that bullying serves a good social purpose, and maybe it does a little bit for some people, but I just don't see it that way. So what is a healthy hierarchy like?
Okay, I can address that, and I could end up going into using the martial arts school as an example. There's this myth that the martial arts school is run by the baddest dude in the school, the guy that can beat everybody up. And that's something that's in place so that it can be sold to retarded Americans who are essentially all victims of this same group bully hierarchy system that goes all the way through school. But how does that really happen? And I was on the staff at Jed Frederick's Kempo Karate and his martial arts school. tragically passed away a couple of months ago, and it was really horrible because he was our leader and our coordinator. He had moral authority in the school. For a couple of years, he was hobbling around until he got his hips replaced. And, I mean, he was literally crippled. He'd have to drag himself along by his hands when he went up and down stairs. And he's still teaching. Well, if somebody needs some contact discipline, if they need punched in the face, well, he's not going to do it. He's got other people for that. And he knows the guys that are good for that. And it wasn't that kind of school, but you'd have the knuckleheads that would show up like Peanut, who might decide that, well, they want to spar with somebody in the school before they join. And then you've got to elect somebody to spar with this guy, and it's either going to be a good thing or a bad thing. But the important thing is that your school and nobody in your school is going to get hurt during this process. I was one of those guys that would, if you are a tough guy and you don't want to attend this school until somebody physically puts you in your place, well, then you can go pick up a stick. You can go spar with James, or you can put on the gloves and you could go box with one of his boxers, and we can take care of it that way. And then there's the fellows from the different arts. There was Matt, there was Gabriel, and there was myself, and we all had different jobs. And one of the jobs you have is keeping Mr. Jim out of trouble. There was a guy that came in there who was an older martial arts instructor who was Jim's senior, who came in and became very insulting. This was a guy that had a history of trying to use a position in the martial arts school as a way to access female companionship. And Jim Frederick didn't want that going on in his school. And he starts telling this guy to leave politely, and the guy says something insulting about one of Jim's students, and Jim started climbing over his desk to get to this guy and choke him out. And, Gabriel ran and grabbed this guy and yelled for me. He ran and grabbed Jim Frederick, so Jim Frederick would not strangle this asshole that came in there and insulted his students. And I walked up to the older gentleman, who was a guy that respected me because he saw me fight a lot, and he wanted to take me under his wing, and he wanted me to be like his guy that would take care of the contact situations. And I was very good at the time. I was still coaching people on how to handle security situations. And I handled him as a security situation, and I talked to him very respectfully, and I walked him out. So we have a hierarchy there that's nothing about bullying. Well, we all have different strengths, and this is a hierarchy that Jim Frederick cobbled together. I want a guy that can do this. I want a guy that can do that. Once Gabriel gets in an argument with somebody, he melts down. So when James and Gabriel are there, if Gabriel starts to melt down, it's James's job to calm him down, because they're real good friends and James can calm him down. And you know what? When Jim melts down, I'm not the guy that goes and calms him down, because that would be insulting. I'm the guy that he had there as the peacemaker and the diplomat. And for me to go up and calm him down would be to very openly tell everybody, well, Mr. Jim's out of control here because Mr. James is calming him down. So no, the perfect guy to calm down Jim Frederick when he gets so pissed off that he's going to do something he's going to regret later is to have the hothead Gabriel calm him down. Very often a guy with a reputation for being a hothead, he's the most effective bucket of water to throw on somebody in that group, because everybody knows when Gabriel's like, whoa, calm down, let's not be emotional. Everybody knows when he says that, then it's really the truth, because this is the guy that would normally fly off the handle and go after somebody because he's got his Puerto Rican temper.
So how did he do that? Were all these, it doesn't seem like these would be explicit agreements, kind of just you guys figured it out.
They aren't. First of all, he vets all of us. Jim Frederick knew Gabriel for 20 years before Gabriel started teaching in his school. They had fought against each other in kickboxing tournaments in the early 1990s. And Gabriel wasn't on staff at the school until 2012. These guys fought in 94. They fought each other. But they both had a lot of respect for each other. And Gabriel needed a guy with organizational ability, a guy whose managerial talents would keep him out of trouble, because he's not a guy that's even good at keeping track of his own bank account, let alone the memberships for a school. Okay, so he needs to be under somebody that's going to be his boss in managerial aspects, because he knows that he'll screw it up. How a lot of martial arts guys do this is what their wife does.
Yeah.
But this was a bachelor school. We didn't have wives to take care of this kind of stuff. And they also needed somebody. I fought at Jim Frederick's school in 2005. At a demo that I actually set up with him. And he knew about me. Lee Dinatelli came to him, and Lee Dinatelli was his senior. Lee Dinatelli used to teach Jim Frederick back in the 1980s down in Hamilton. Lee Dinatelli said, Mr. Jim, you need James here. And he said, I know who James is. And Lee said, it's time. We need somebody that does what he does here now, because this MMA thing's going to overcome you and leave you behind. And while you're looking for a jiu-jitsu guy, he eventually got Matt Graham. While you're looking for a jiu-jitsu guy, you need to have a boxer, a guy that does boxing. And it would be nice to have somebody that can fight with weapons here too, to keep more people here. You don't want somebody that wants weapon instruction to have to go to another school and leave your school. You want to be able to provide it here. So over 2 decades, he builds alliances with guys that he has experience with, not being in the same organization. He's got to see us at our best and our worst in freestyle situations, operating under other guys that ran martial arts events in schools. And he can vet us. He knows guys that we trained that have come to him. And he could even guess. Jim Frederick would be able to look at how you threw a jab, and he could tell which guy in town taught you how to throw the jab and where you learned it. So he became an aficionado in his social circle, and he's able to actually piece together an organic hierarchy where our personalities naturally work together. This is like the dream crew on a construction site, where you actually have all the right temperaments and the skill sets together. It took him decades to do that.
To me, it sounds like that all these men became very competent in their own arenas, whatever it is that they specialized in, and through that developed this network and connections and then alliances. So how do you teach people who are really looking for the social aspect of knowing other men and meeting them and connecting and establishing this? Because this is a question that you got on Twitter as well. Someone was asking about how does a high IQ person connect with a low IQ person? It's sort of connected, because I think IQ is just something that people hide behind when they don't have this social ability to create these connections, and they'll say, "Oh well, I'm just too smart."
I can address it a couple of different ways. For a second, if we stick with the martial arts thing, biomechanical IQ. This Gabriel, he's a genius, okay, but he has a hard time communicating with people that are physically retarded, because the guy's a natural athlete. So this is like your really intelligent scientist having a hard time communicating with somebody that's essentially like a homeless dude and can't even figure out how to pay his bills, even when he's got enough money to do it. So there's the aspect of being able to understand that you're going to have some weak spots and look for people in your life that have strong spots. We're taught in current society that this is what your mate is for. This is what a woman is for a man. They both complement each other. One is good at what the other one isn't good with, and to a certain extent, that's what marriage is about. But it's a lot more complicated when you get outside of the family and you're dealing with a group of people that are committed to a pursuit. Tony Cox is currently editing or proofreading the Sunset Saga, which is like 1.5 million words that I did. And the central aspect of that story, which is overtly, it's about time travel. What it's really about on a level of the characters is oddballs learning how to work with each other. And I had this experience when I came out of being bullied and then became a bully myself. And when this highly intelligent guy insulted me, my only answer was to beat him up. And now when I did this, he ran away from me, so the people in the school didn't see it, but I lost all my friends. I mean, all the people that had grown to like me because I could stand up for myself, when I turned around and decided to physically punish this really intelligent, not physical guy, I was persona non grata. I no longer had any friends in that school until I beat him up, and he became my friend. And he just like laid there and looked at me. And one of the first scenes in the Sunset Saga is really this, where Jay Bracken beats up this character named Charlie. And I based him on this actual kid that I went to school with named Charlie. And I'm hitting this guy after I catch him behind this pine tree that's still there. I saw it when I walked by the school the other day because I'm back in the neighborhood where I grew up in. And he looked up at me and he said, "Why are you doing this?" I said, "I have to." I said, "They'll know. I told you that I was going to beat you up every day after school for the rest of the year, so I'm going to do it. If I don't do it, then people won't understand that I mean business." And he said, "Well, how about if they think you beat me up?" He said, "Because I tell you don't like doing this." He's laying underneath me. I got my knee in his stomach, and I just hit him in the chest. And he said, "You don't want to do this." He said, "Wouldn't you rather like go home and play with my model car collection or my army men or something like that? Do you still like to do that kind of stuff?" I was like, "Yeah, but I don't have anybody to play with. Nobody does like men in cars anymore." And he's like, "Well, come on with me, and we'll be buddies." And so what we do is I chase him to this tree every day, and people look at me, and he's telling stories about how I beat him up and everything like that, and he's using his imagination. It's like, this guy, he's got this way of hitting you. It doesn't even leave any marks, and I'm afraid he's going to kill my family if I say anything. I'm afraid to say anything. So he actually becomes popular, and I become totally ostracized, and which actually served my purpose. Nobody ever messed with me after this. They're like, this guy is a psychopath, okay? And it also got him a very functional bodyguard, because it turned out one of the reasons why he didn't eat at lunchtime was that there was these junior high school kids that used to wait in the alley across the street, because the junior high school kids get out first so that they can prey upon the elementary school kids. I guess that's why they schedule it that way. And we go walking down this back alley to where he lives, and there's these two dudes that are older than me, and they're about my size, but they're not dudes I'm intimidated. At this point in my mind, I'm just a killer. I attack anything that threatens me. And these guys are standing with their back up to this fence, and they're looking at Charlie, and they're giving him hard looks, and they're looking at me kind of nervous. And I'm just walking by, baring my teeth at these guys, snarling at these guys. And I didn't figure out until later, when I met Charlie's mother, they used to call me James West, because his favorite show was the Wild Wild West. And he said, "Mom, isn't Jimmy like James West? Look at his muscles, and he can do push-ups forever." And I was his bodyguard. I kept him from having to give his lunch money up to these two junior high school kids, and I didn't even figure it out until after his mother thanked me for looking out for her son. He got home safely from school, and he didn't get picked on from older kids because he had this psychopath as his friend. And this is a very important lesson if you think about it. Whichever guy you are, if you're Charlie, okay, and you're the genius, and you're dealing with this knucklehead, well, you could use your superior communication skills to turn the whole school against this guy and just totally ostracize him, and he just becomes this lonely kid that walks home alone from school, and nobody wants to be his friend. And the ostracization will probably protect you, because he's not going to beat you up, because the whole school is going to be against him, and they're going to pull this guy off of you, and then they're going to go to the teachers, and he's going to be gone. Problem solved. But you don't do that goon any favors. That goon doesn't get anything out of this. So if you're Charlie and you're the smart guy, you want to do what Charlie did. Charlie actually gave me the best friendship of my childhood. There was another kid named Chris who actually saved me from getting beat up, and was like my older brother up until the point he went to high school. And now Charlie became my new friend, because now Chris was doing his own thing in high school, and I didn't need his protection anymore. So Charlie needed some protection, and I needed somebody with a brain that I could play with and do stuff with. I had a hard time. I liked cars and models and tank models, but I had a hard time putting them together. I really had a hard time following the directions. So he showed me the principles of how you put the model together, even if you don't have the directions, and at every model you start with this piece and how it went together. So he showed me how to build model tanks and things like that. And he got something out of it. And me, on the other hand, if I'm the knucklehead, and now I found myself sometimes in a position where I'm the knucklehead, like where I live with the sissy rich. Okay. I'm basically like their bipedal, bald, hairless Rottweiler. Okay. That's, I'm like the family, I'm the family pet. I protect them. And eventually they're going to show me how to hook this desktop computer up when the master of the house isn't too busy and I'm not too busy writing something. So when you're the knucklehead, you've got to realize that when you're Gabriel at the martial arts school, you got to find a father figure that's going to advise you and not try to solve all the problems by yourself, because eventually that's going to result in you knocking somebody's teeth down their throat and you're going to get in trouble. So at a certain point, when you're building a hierarchy amongst men, the guy that's the strongest has got to decide that he's going to look out for the weakest person. And the guy that's the smartest has got to decide that he's going to look out for the stupidest person. And he's going to do the opposite of bullying. He's going to build them up. He's going to do whatever he can. And the guy that's in the middle, that's, that like Big Ron took an IQ test and he found out that he was like in that 120 IQ range. And the guy giving the test said, these are good people. These are the kind of people that are good in management because they can communicate with geniuses and they can communicate with idiots. And the geniuses and the idiots can't communicate with each other. Well, if you're that high energy, mid-range IQ person, well, then your job should be making sure that the idiot and the genius get along together and that the weakling and the strong man get along together. And if you're the dangerous guy, like Dante, I talked about him before, to him, my oldest son, is sacred to him. You don't touch Vance, because that's how Dante really got all of his positive parenting as far as the compassion and everything through Vance's parents, because he was friends with Vance. He had a lot of what he needed as a 6 to 10-year-old boy because Vance was his best friend. And, Vance was a smarter guy. And so this is really what you're looking for. When you're amongst a group of men, you're putting yourself as a piece of the puzzle together in this so that you complement the other people, and you're just not concentrating on what the other guy isn't good at. Yeah. You're valuing people for what they're good at.
I think that it really speaks to the opposite of this monoculture that we have, and school is like the first phase of it, but it takes place now socially where everybody sorts out to where they fit in with other people like themselves. So it's hard to imagine a world. If you're an office worker in a cube, you're surrounded by people who are almost exactly like yourself in other cubes. And I think maybe that's where this is coming from, where it's hard for people to relate and hard for people to build these contacts because we're all really segregated according to our roles.
You could tell when Jim Frederick died, the number of hard men that I saw crying, or who couldn't even talk to me on the phone because their voice was going to crack up, was really telling. And if you think about it, I talked about him, Gabriel, myself, Lee, who was the older man who did a lot to gather us together, Mr. Matt. We all suffered that retarded public school system. We all came from that. And we didn't build a meaningful, functional network that operated on the cohesion level of a family until we were in our 40s. If we didn't have public schools to suck us away from our parents, and our parents didn't have to buy a new house every 7 years to put us in a new neighborhood, if we would have all grown up in the same neighborhood, we would have had that when we were 18. And imagine if our neighborhood was based on maybe a certain aspect of the economy. Maybe there's a factory. Maybe it's an area where people work as hunting guides and ranchers or whatever. Then we're already at 18. We already have a functional masculine hierarchy that's not just a bully pecking order. It's not just the richest guy running things, not just the smartest guy, not just the meanest guy or the toughest guy running things, but it's people working together. And in a natural setting, you could have that right out of the gate as an adult. Yeah. But it took us our lifetime to do it, and then Jim died.
I talked to Ishmael not on our podcast, but another time, and he talked about how when he was young, as a child or a young man, that they would go on these hunting trips with all of the men, not all the men in town, but this variety of men, that the banker would be there and his dad would be there, and his dad, for those who don't remember or didn't hear it, was a miner and a shepherd, and and the town banker and the town attorney are there, and they're all sitting around the same campfire and sharing something. And I think that's a lot more rare nowadays.
Yes, yeah, we got to look back in time when we talked to Ishmael about his upbringing. And like I said, it's with the people in the martial arts and combat arts fraternity that I've been involved with. It's an ongoing thing. By the time you learn how to build your group, guys are dying. But along the way, you can help other people out. And hopefully some of the younger guys that got together under us, guys that we were fighting against each other and guys that we were training, hopefully the relationships that they formed at a younger age it's going to serve them better at an earlier age than ours did, because we really didn't even get to know each other until we were after 40, and that's a shame.
Well, thank you, James. I think we covered a lot of good ground, and I think that's going to do it for today.
Thank you, Lynn.
That was episode 32.